I know in these little spotlights, we usually highlight creative Black women and art women that are authors. But tonight we're going to take a little bit of a different turn and we're going to celebrate a visionary that is a creative Black man. And he's creative across all fields. Today we're joined by Forrest Isaac Jones, an award winning author who has dedicated his work to exploring the deep connections between the civil rights movements, resilience, and history. His latest nonfiction book sheds light on how Black struggles from freedom in the U.S. to inspired movements abroad, particularly in North Ireland. From the untold stories of African Americans at D Day to the lessons we can learn from history today. Forrest is going to take us on a journey through time. Let's get into it. Hello, Forrest.
Hi, Cami. How are you?
I am awesome. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much.
So let me ask you this. What first sparked your love for storytelling? And how did your mother's influence sort of shape the way you write today?
Storytelling really came to me at a very young age. I can still remember both my parents reading to me at a very young age. I can remember uh, age 4 and 5, right before bedtime. One of them would be reading stories to me. I can still remember my dad reading The Big Bad Wolf and pretending he was the wolf and he was going to blow the house down. And it just invigorated me. I loved it. I loved the stories. I loved them to tell me stories and read to me at night. So knowing that, I went to school, of course, K through 5 and middle school. I was your typical boy. I'd rather be outside. I'd rather be playing sports, doing anything but reading. Which ironically, my mom was a reading teacher, so I kind of flew in the face of everything that she stood for and tried to, instill in us as children. And I can still remember, this is how bad it was. I can remember her. She had these kits, these reading kits, and they had they were cards. You read a story on the front, and you answered questions on the back. And I can remember in summer, typical teacher, my mom, she would say, "All right, I'm going to pay you money if you read these and answer the questions." And I so was against reading, I would even do it for money. I was like, I'm not doing this. I don't care how much you pay me. So she continued, she didn't give up. She continued to try to get me to read. And then when I was in high school, I think I was maybe, it might have been my sophomore year, freshman or sophomore year. Um, I remember going into her library and just by the luck of the draw, I picked out a book, and you'll love this. It was a Sidney Sheldon book. And if you know
Okay.
anything about Sidney Sheldon back in the day, Sidney Sheldon was all about, steamy romance and action and thriller and all that. So I read the book, and I'll be honest, I can't remember what the name of the book. Well, yeah, I do. It was Bloodline. Bloodline. Bloodline was the book. I read Bloodline, and I bet you I read that book 3, 4 times. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It was action. It really triggered my imagination, and I was hooked. You know when they say when you read something, you're hooked. I was hooked. So after that, I was like, man, I want to teach and I want to be a writer. Those are the things I really want to do. And during that journey, I also became a lover of history. I had this wonderful social studies teacher when I was in seventh grade. His name is Buddy Ward, still alive, and still consider him a mentor. Both my parents were teachers, but I never thought about teaching. I didn't want to do what my parents did. No, of course not. So Mr. Ward taught social studies, and all because of Mr. Ward, I was like, man, I want to do what Mr. Ward does. I want to be a teacher. I want to be a history teacher. So fast forward to college and all that. I was a history major. I continued to do some, dabbling in writing, but history was my love. I really, really enjoyed history and I loved it. I just loved, again, the storytelling. History, you're telling a story when you teach history. So I taught for 10 years. I taught history and again, absolutely loved it. you're telling stories. You're telling stories about people. You're telling stories about civilizations. So after that, one of the things that really hooked me again with the history was my own family history. Um, I remember as a young college student, I think I was probably about 20, 21 years old, my grandmother told me the story about my grandfather. I'd never heard the story before. My grandfather passed away years ago in 1980. And she told me the story of my grandfather, who was 5 years old at the time, back in the mid 30s, lived in Georgia. One day, his father was going, my great grandfather was going to work, and he told my grandfather goodbye, never saw him again, disappeared. Now, of course, in the black civilization, we have hundreds of those stories where unfortunately something, sinister happens to a loved one. My grandfather never got over that. And to this day, we still don't know what happened. We have some theories, we have some stories we've heard, but long story short, that affected my grandfather throughout his life. And my grandmother said he never talked about it because that story was still so painful, still traumatic. So again, I took that story, its history, and I did, a short story about that. So again, there have been so many experiences throughout my life where history and writing have kind of, intermingled and kind of given me the reason to do what I do. I love history. I love storytelling. I think we all have a story. I think you talk to people, everybody has some sort of story, and I just truly enjoy writing about it and talking to people about it.
Okay, now your work heavily focuses on the civil rights and historical connections. Was there a specific moment that made you realize that that was the path, or this was the path you wanted to take?
It was probably, got to get my years straight here. I would say about 6 or 7 years ago. My parent or my mom was or still is friends with a lady. I don't know if a lot of older black women are part of either AKA, chums, dinner dance, you name it, a whole bunch of
They,
different
they
groups.
had different types of social clubs.
Correct,
Yes.
correct. So she was in a social club with a woman who lived in Roanoke, and the woman was telling her story about her husband and about her husband who had been at D-Day. Now you got to remember, I'm a history major. Okay, I think I know everything there is about history. So my mom came home one night and she called me and she said, "You have got to meet this man." I was like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "You've got to meet this man who was at D-Day." And I told her, I said, "Mom, there were no black people at D-Day. What are you talking about?" She was like, "Yes, there were. You need to talk to him and you need to see what this is all about." So, uh, COVID happened and a few other things happened. And during COVID, things were locked down, didn't have a lot of stuff to do. And I started thinking more and more about this story because I hadn't met him yet. And I was thinking, man, I was like, I wonder what that story is all about. I'm very curious. In the meantime, another book had come out called Forgotten. And Forgotten was a story of some of the black soldiers who had been at D-Day. So I read that. I noticed his name was in there. I said, I want to learn more about this. So uh, I interviewed, his name's William Dabney, and it's one of the essays that I was lucky
Mhm.
enough to win an award for. And I met Mr. Dabney, and first of all, I called him. I said, "Hey, I would love to talk to you and hear your story." He invited me over to his house, and my brother, who co-wrote the piece with me, came with me. We were at his house for a couple of hours. It was amazing. To this day, it's still one of the most worthwhile interviews I've ever done. Just hearing his story, hearing what he did, telling you the story of what it was like to land on the beach and to have to hide because there was shooting and have to pretend you were dead because of Najee. I mean, it was amazing. So interviewed him for a couple hours, wrote up the story, sent it to he and his wife to make sure they were fine with it. They both liked it, and I started sending the story out. Well, I interviewed him. I want to say it was in October of that year, and he passed away 3 months later.
Wow.
I want to say he was 94 if I remember correctly, but that kind of told me I was meant to do this. Something made me at that time and moment. You need to talk to this man. You need to hear his story. You need to put this out there. So that kind of gave me the taste of, okay, I like mysteries, I like thrillers, but man, there's so many stories in terms of the African American, journey. So many more that we probably don't even know about. But this was a great story that I was able to interview Mr. Dabney. I was able to put his story down. I was even lucky enough. I did World War II magazine, which is an international magazine, saw the story and said, "Hey, would you like to expand it?" Because I only wrote a 2,000 word essay for Writer's Digest. I said, "Yeah, I would love to." So I expanded it. We put pictures in it, and they actually published that story, an expanded story about Mr. Dabney this past fall. So it was such a wonderful experience. His wife is still alive. I was able to go see his wife back in October to give her a copy of the magazine and to, just tell her, hey, if it wasn't for you all, this would not have happened. Great story about Mr. Dabney. You'll appreciate this. Um, Back when I want to say he was in his 80s, they had a tribute over in Paris for all the D-Day people. He was lucky enough to go over there, and two people he ran into, or three people. One was President Obama at the time, and he went up and he shook President Obama's hand, and he said, President Obama said, "Dabney, I know who you are. You don't need to introduce yourself." He said, "I know exactly who you are," and Mr. Dabney thought that was neat. And then the other thing was, which is interesting, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, there were no black faces in there at all. Zero. None. So if you watch that movie, you're thinking there were no black people there. And Mr. Dabney met Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg at the event in France. They both told him, "We feel so bad. We did not know. We did not know." And it explains why there were no black people in that movie. They had no idea. They didn't know. You know. So again, stories like that, continue to get them out there, continue to make sure people know about them. And that was a biggie for me to kind of tell myself, hey, you need to keep doing this. This is good.
Now, you mentioned winning that award a little bit earlier. How has winning that award sort of shaped your career? And do you feel any added responsibility as a historian and writer?
I think the way it shaped my career, number one, is it, and you hate to say this, but it's true. It kind of validates you. You write for years and years and you get rejections and I don't like it, we don't want it, we don't need it. And then when somebody says, especially somebody like Writer's Digest, which is one of the most well-known writing magazines, says your story is good, you kind of think, you know what? I am good. I've got a story to tell. I can do this. So I can remember finding out about it. I can remember it did. I felt validated. I felt like, you know what, this is something I meant to do. All the hard work that I put in for years is finally starting to pay off. That being said, the second part of your question, you know, after that, I kind of knew history was my path. I kind of knew nonfiction was my path. So I continued to write nonfiction. I'm very lucky. I won the award 3 years in a row. And the second year I won it for a nonfiction story that deals with the Lumbee Indians in North Carolina back in 1958. A lot of people don't know this story, but the Klan started try to take over a small town in North Carolina. The Lumbee Indians who lived in that town basically ran them out, and it's an incredible story. So that was the one that I won for that as well. And then the last one this past year I won, um, talking about the connection between the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Movement in Northern Ireland. So again, the story about Mr. Dabney, being able to interview Mr. Dabney really was the thing that kind of set me on my path for history and nonfiction. And I've been lucky that since then things have been going in a very positive direction. And let's be frank too. I think when you approach publishers and people like that, and you can say, "Hey, I have one X, Y, and Z," I think people see that like, "Oh, wow, maybe we need to read what he's writing."
Absolutely, because it adds more credibility to some of the
Yeah,
things that you're doing. Now,
yeah.
civil rights history is often sanitized or simplified. How do you ensure that your work presents a full and authentic view of these movements?
It's a great question. I think two things. I think number one, being a history teacher, I used to. I've taught K-12. I've taught college as well. I emphasize to my students about primary sources. Primary sources are so important. If you can get journals, if you can get diaries, if you can get actual stories that people who have written that were there, that participated in it. That's huge when you're trying to tell these stories about especially about civil rights. Um, you also need to make sure, if you can, to do interviews. The project that I just finished, that the book, of course, is being released in a couple months. Took me 3 years to do, but it had to take that much time because I had to. I was determined if I was going to do this story, especially about civil rights, I had to talk to people that were there. I had to talk to people that were on the front lines. They were called names. They had the Klan across the street from them. They were beaten by police. It's not it's easy to take stuff from like newspapers and stuff like that, which I did, don't get me wrong. But to have those stories of people that were on the front lines, I think that's one of the reasons that this book um came together so well, because when people read it, they're like, my gosh, to hear so and so tell their story about when they were on the Pettus Bridge and the police were, starting to beat them. I mean, that's what history is all about. That's what storytelling is all about. That's as authentic as you can get. And I think going back to your question about civil rights, you know, you can't sanitize it. It happened, and when you've got people that you're interviewing that are telling you, hey, this happened, this is how it happened, um, you've got to put it in there. I will say this is interesting, and this happened, but with the people I talked to dealing with the civil rights movement here, and the people that I talked to dealing with it in Northern Ireland, there were some stories that they did not want me to put in, which I understand because there's still a lot of open wounds to those stories. Um, there are still events that happened 60 years ago in both places that are still traumatic for people. And I think, again, going back to your question about civil rights, you know, when you're talking to people about their experiences and what they lived through and what they are still dealing with and what they still dream about and have nightmares about, that's as real as you can get. And you have to be very careful when you're interviewing them and when you're telling those stories, that you need to make sure that you're not pushing them too much, because trauma is difficult. It's difficult. And I don't care how old you are. My parents are both 81 years old. They lived through the civil rights movement. They did march and things like that. And there's still things that they talk about to this day that they're like, my gosh, that was a horrible situation.
So you mentioned Northern Ireland a few minutes ago, but in your pre-interview, you said that there's more that connects us than that divides us. How do you see the theme playing out in the histories of the U.S. and in Northern Ireland?
Yes. One of the things I'm proud about with this book is that I think it shows, just like you said, there are so many things that connect us as a people, as humans, as human beings. And when you look at what our people were fighting for here in the United States especially in the 60s, you're talking about housing, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about voting, you're talking about equal rights, you're talking about all that stuff. Basic human rights, basic human rights. And when you look at Northern Ireland, what they were going through in the 60s, especially the late 60s, very similar. I mean, it's almost when you hear these stories, it's almost eerie how similar things were there compared to here. Um, there was gerrymandering in Northern Ireland. You couldn't get jobs if you were a Catholic. If you had a house of 8 people, let's say you had a wife, a husband, and let's say you had, um, six kids. Let's say they were all over 18, all living in one house. If you were a Catholic, you had one vote for that house. That's it. You had one vote. So you talk about disenfranchised. Okay. Um, you had police brutality. Some of the stories that come out in this book about what the police did at some of these civil rights marches mirrors exactly what happened at Selma and places like that. That being said, what did they do? They marched. They marched. And I was reading an article yesterday about one of the people that I interviewed um, in Northern Ireland. His name is Eamon McCann. He's a very big civil rights activist over there. He's in his late 70s, and he's kind of very similar to what John Lewis was over here for African Americans. And he was at a commemoration event this past weekend, and he was quoted. He said, "What we did in the '60s is what people still need to do." And he said, "It's not about weapons. It's not about guns, you name it." He said it's about getting people in the street and marching. And again, that's what both groups did. Both groups marched. You see what we did for our people in terms of marching, in terms of protesting. The reason you saw the change in Northern Ireland, people got out in the streets, people marched, people protested. They demanded equal rights. They demanded the rights to be a human being and to live in their country and to be able to vote and be able to own a house and be able to have a job. When you go there today, I was lucky enough to go there and do some interviews in person, and you look at the murals in neighborhoods. You have murals of Martin Luther King. You have murals of Malcolm X. You have murals of John Lewis. They looked at the African American Black civil rights movement and they basically used that as a template for their own civil rights movement. And even to this day, you'll have people over there say, we couldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for what you all did in the United States.
I can believe that. Now, a lot of what you write about focuses on a lot of stories that have been overlooked. Outside of the people that you've currently mentioned, who do you think has the most powerful untold story that you've encountered?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think for me, when I did this book, and my parents hadn't even heard of this either. Of course, they're both 81 years old. When you think of Selma, you automatically think Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Andrew Young, and some other folks as well. But when I did my research, I learned that there was a group of people called the Courageous Eight. And the Courageous Eight, just what it said, 8 people that lived in Selma teachers, doctors, business owners, black Americans who got together and decided something's got to be done about what's going on in terms of civil rights in Selma and the other areas. They were the whole reason why Martin Luther King went there. I had no idea. I did not know that. They were the whole reason why they decided to start protesting, to start marching. Um, what they did to kind of set up what we know of as the Selma marches, the Selma to Montgomery march, they did all this, but it's like their story disappeared. Because again, I'm a history major. I'd never heard of them before. You may have, but I'd never heard of them before. Um, to learn their story and to interview. Now, sadly, the ones that actually lived back then, of course, they passed away. But I talked to their children. I talked to a couple grandkids who were there when some of this happened, and it was incredible because I had not heard the story before, and I was like, "Man, I've got to put this in the book," because you're talking about 8 people who had a huge impact on the civil rights movement and on Martin Luther King going to Selma. One of the most incredible stories I heard, one of the Courageous Eight, and I want to say it was his daughter who told me this story. Um, back, I want to say it was 64. He was driving in his car, and the Klan came up to his car and basically kidnapped him. He's driving down the street, and he's thinking he's going to die, of course. And I put this in the book because it's an incredible story. They're driving, and then all of a sudden, don't know why, one of the Klan members says, "Hey, let him go." They pulled off, they let him out, he survived. To this day, they still don't know why they did it. They still don't know what the reasoning was, but that story is incredible. And only by the grace of God was that person able to survive. But again, those are the stories that you hear these people saying, and it's just like, my gosh, it's incredible what these people went through and what they did so that we could do what we're doing tonight. I mean, real seriously. I mean, I don't want people to forget that too. I think that's the big thing too. Being a teacher or being a former teacher, I think history is probably the most important subject there is because I think we've got to remember what people did before us to get us where we are today. And I think we can never forget that. And when I met some of the civil rights leaders in Northern Ireland, the first thing I told them was, thank you, because Catholics in Northern Ireland wouldn't have the rights they have today if it wasn't for you all, what you all did in the 60s and 70s.
So let's switch this up a little bit. Let's ask a couple of questions about your writing process. Now, how do
Mhm.
you approach your research process? What goes into uncovering the lesser known historical stories that you find?
A lot of digging. A lot of digging. One thing I did, and I'll kind of use the essays I've done in the book as examples, is you try as much as you can to get good primary sources, and that might be you know, going to the archives, National Archives, going up to DC and visiting some of the archives up there. I did that when I was researching a lot of the stuff for Selma and stories about Selma. You also can find good pictures in those places. There's certain things you can find online, but you have to be very careful that there are legitimate sources, that they're places that are giving accurate information. I'm gonna be very honest with you, Cami. Though one of the things that I've learned doing a lot of history nonfiction is that you need help from people. You need help from actual people that know people that can get you in touch with certain people. Because I'll be honest with you, one of the things that helped me was I'm a member of the uh, Boulay organization, which is well known, of course, for African Americans in the United States. And one of my Boulay brothers um, was friends with somebody who knew somebody who was at Selma. So through him, I was able to get contacts to help me with these interviews. Um, once you do the archive searches, once you set up the interviews, and then once you are doing your research online, you do all three of those things. And then basically, probably one of the hardest things to do, which I despise, but you have to do it, is you have to basically transcribe all these interviews. And that takes time. That takes a lot of time. Um, you're transcribing the interviews, you're actually writing down every word that they're saying. When you're doing that, you also want to, give it back to them to take a look at it and make sure that you're being accurate as to the information that you're giving. Um, that's probably my least favorite part of research. And then when you get into the actual writing part, the process of the writing, again, it goes back to what you said at the beginning. You're telling a story. You don't want to spit it out just like it's just research. I tried to write this book as a story, as a very cohesive story that connected well together. Um, Talking about the beginnings of the civil rights movement in the United States, talking about the beginnings of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and then looking at how Northern Ireland did this because we did this in Selma, or they did this there because we did it at another march. So you try to connect those places. Um, Also, when you're doing research, this is hugely important, is you got to source everything. You've got to source everything. So, especially nonfiction history, anything you're taking down, you've got to source. That was an extremely tedious part of this. Um, Having to go back and get the sources for each thing, each interview, each quote, things like that. Because when you're doing nonfiction history, there's a very certain way you have to do the quotes for really each chapter. That is a very difficult process. I'll be honest with you, the writing is probably the easiest part, but the other part, the sources and the transcribing and all that stuff, it is a very, very long process. That being said, it's wonderful when you get to the end and you see it come together and you're like, man, this is good. This is all coming together. You can see it blossom into something really good.
Now, um, what challenges have you faced as a nonfiction writer, particularly when dealing with topics that some may find extremely controversial?
Sure. Uh, I think there were two things. I think number one, and it kind of goes back to what you said, you have to make sure that you're not whitewashing anything. You have to make sure you're not sanitizing anything. You want to make sure you're being true to the people that you interview and the stories that you're telling. Um, it's been difficult, or was difficult, interviewing. I'd interviewed some people in person. I interviewed some people face to face. And going back to what we mentioned earlier, when you're dealing with things that have been very traumatic for people, you have to really, really tread carefully in how you're asking questions, how deep you want to get into stuff. I'm one of those people, when I interview, I try to feel the person out. Do they want to tell me more? You can tell. You can definitely tell when, okay, I need to back off a little bit. Funny story. I was talking to one of the relatives of the Courageous Eight from Selma, and when I first called her, I told her, hey, so and so gave me your number. I would love to interview you, and she was like, well, I just really don't want to talk. I'm not, just not in the mood to talk. And I told her what I was doing, and she ended up talking to me for 45 minutes, which was great. So I think sometimes you get the initial apprehension in terms of going back to those stories, which I completely understand. I completely understand. The other thing you have to be really careful of, and I was telling somebody this in another interview I did a couple of weeks ago, is that we have to remember too with these movements that you had a lot of white people that were part of the civil rights movement. When you look at pictures in the Selma to Montgomery March, especially, a lot of white people participated. I think we can't forget that hey, there were many different people that wanted change and wanted to see a positive difference in the United States. On the flip side, in Northern Ireland, there were Protestants that were part of the civil rights movement that didn't like what was happening to Catholics and didn't appreciate what was going on. So I think that's another thing. I had to be really careful in the book to make sure you weren't portraying, okay, there were no white people that wanted this, or there were no Protestants that wanted that. I had to be really careful to make sure people understood there were people that were part of this positive movement as well. I think the other thing, and we didn't touch upon this at all, but I had to be careful of, this is a book about civil rights. It's a book about the women and the men who participated in both countries. Um, in Northern Ireland, especially, you've probably heard of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, the terrorist organization that was there for years. If you look at the name of the book, it says 1963 to 1972. I did that on purpose because in 1972 in Northern Ireland, basically the civil rights movement almost was dismantled because of a really bad attack on Catholics over there, which led their movement to tend to go more toward the radical side, not thinking marching was the right thing. A lot of people joining the IRA. I tried to avoid that because I don't know enough about that topic to get into it. I wanted to stick strictly with the civil rights movement, the marches and the protests. The same thing can be said for, there was a lot of controversy even here in the 70s with people thinking King was not forceful enough. He didn't do enough. We need to do more. We need the rise of the Black Panthers, of Angela Davis. They've got a very small part in the book, um, because ironically, some of the civil rights leaders of Northern Ireland came over to New York to meet Angela Davis and the Black Panthers. So again, you've got that connection there of even the movement, even some radical parts of the movements trying to connect because they saw what was happening with the Black Panthers in the United States.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about your book. Why don't you tell everyone the name of your book and what it is you hope readers will take away from it?
Sure, sure. The name of the book is Good Trouble, which, if you know anything about the civil rights movement, that was John Lewis's motto: stir some good trouble. Good Trouble, the Selma, Alabama, and Derry, Northern Ireland connection, 1963 to 1972. Derry was the march that was inspired by the Selma to Montgomery March. They had a march in 1963, Belfast to Derry. So that's where you get the connection from, because they basically looked at the Selma to Montgomery March and copied that for the Belfast to Derry March. Um, the book is available everywhere, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop, you name it. It is available for pre-order, and it will be released on April the 1st. And I've got some um, dates that I can give you later, Cami, about where I'll be in certain places for some book signings and some book festivals. So right now, we just finished the edits about a week ago, no, 2 weeks ago, and the publisher and the marketing people are sending it out to the press to get some more reviews. We've had some very positive reviews so far, but they're sending it out to more of the press. And in the next 2 months, we're hoping to, through the marketing team and the publisher, just more press, hopefully some more interviews, hopefully some more reviews to just get word out about the book that will be out on April 1st. I think what people will get out of this book will be um, the fight for human rights, the fight for equal rights. Very timely, extremely timely. And I think it's good. I think people who have read it already have said probably the biggest thing, and my parents were two people that said it. I did not know that some of the same stuff that was going on here was going on with the Catholics in Northern Ireland. And I did not know that the Catholics looked at the Black Civil Rights Movement as the model for what they needed to do to get their equal rights. So I think people will see that. And I think also people will see, hey, we are proud of what we did here. But man, there are a lot of people around the world, Northern Ireland, that's also proud of what we did and what we stood up for. Because a lot of the people I talked to over there, they can still remember seeing the images on TV about Selma, about the March on Washington, and being inspired, and just as a people, what our our grandfathers and parents did to inspire so many people even today.
So, what advice would you give to aspiring writers, especially those interested in historical nonfiction writing?
Sure. If they're interested in historical nonfiction, my probably two biggest pieces of advice would be number one, find a topic that you're really interested in. Because I think when you find that topic that kind of gets your juices flowing and gets you interested, that's going to take you through the project. Because if you're not invested in it, somebody told me, they said, "You know what? I know why your book is so good." I said, "Why?" Because you loved it. You loved writing it. You can tell in the book, you can tell in your words that you enjoyed writing this story. And I think you've got to find something that you're interested in. I think the other piece of advice I would give would be get as much research, primary sources, interviews that you can do. Um, the more you talk to people, the stories you get from people, it's only going to make your story so much better. There is no way this book would have been, I think, as good as people say. I'm not saying it, as people are saying it is, if it hadn't been for those stories that I got from the people that I interviewed. So I can't thank those people enough for taking the time to talk to me because they made this book.
All right. Well, I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. And I've already invited you back, and I can't wait for the book to come out so we can actually do an interview about the book and the release of the book as well. Okay.
Definitely. Kami, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to interview me. I look forward to talking with you again.
Likewise. You guys, Forrest Isaac Jones reminds us that history isn't just something in the past, it shapes our present and our future. His work uncovers the connections that bind us, reminding us that the struggles for justice and equality are universal. If you want to read more of his work, check out his book on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. Keep up with his journey as he continues to bring his hidden histories to light. Thank you, Forrest, for sharing your story with us today. And as always, we look forward to working with any author out there who'd like to be spotlighted on Dear Black Woman's Author Spotlight. Have a good night, you guys.